Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
When the company had actually asked the Alberta government for the letter of exemption, they state this, and one of the funny things was I said to my husband Darcy, so what did your border guard, the security lady, say when you showed her the letter? So she wasn't even interested in reading it. So I'm like, so what on earth is the point in us following the rules and regulations that they set out if somebody is just going to decide to wake up one morning and not do their job? Do you know what I mean? That's what angers me. How are we supposed to follow rules when those that are making the rules aren't following them themselves?
What if you're someone who has been deemed an essential worker? What if you're somebody who regularly travels across the border for work, so you're normally exempt from the Liberals' quarantine measures? And what if you already had an exemption given to you by the Alberta government to reinforce the fact that these quarantine measures just don't apply to you? And yet, somehow, you still get abducted from the airport to a COVID hotel. Well, that's exactly what happened to Amanda Duke's husband. She went to the airport to pick up her husband this week. Now, he's an oil patch worker, and he's been working in New Mexico, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, like so many of the guys in the oil patch who needed to leave the country to find a job. Her husband was under the impression that he would be able to come back into the country and go home to his home. By the way, his house is in the middle of nowhere. They live in the country. So her husband's coming from the desert where he's completely isolated with the guys on his rig, and he was flying home, and then he was going to go straight home, like he's done dozens of times already. And he has assurances that he would be able to do those things. Except then he wasn't, and he's in a COVID jail. Take a listen.
So he flew down to New Mexico for his hitch 2 weeks ago. And that was, I want to say, a day before the new legislation was introduced, before it came into effect on the 22nd. So obviously we were all a little bit concerned with not knowing how the guys were going to get back and so on. So luckily the company that he works for jumped on it. They had their lawyers, their immigration people look into it to make sure that when they flew back into Canada after these regulations had come into place, that the guys were going to be okay, because the talking point was if they were going to have to stay down there, then that's what they do. You do what you need to do, right? So they were all given a letter from actually signed by Dina Hinshaw to say that they were exempt. So we're thinking, great, the regulations came into play. I drove down to Calgary Airport when he landed last night. He text messaged me to say, I've just landed, just got to go through the rigmarole of paperwork and so on, and I'll see you in a bit. And then I didn't hear anything from him. And I'm like, hey, what's going on? And then sort of 5 minutes later, I get a message to say, well, it looks like I'm not coming home. They're taking me to a hotel. And I said, what? What do you mean they're taking you to a hotel? How can that be? You've got all your paperwork. The government says you're exempt. How is this possible? And I'd just like to add, there wasn't just my husband flying. He was flying with one of the other guys on the rig as well. So same rig, same hitch, same everything. The two of them were flying back together. They'd seen different border guards, and it turns out, we didn't know at the time, that the guy my husband flew down with, he sailed through, jumped in his truck and went home, whereas my husband got a border guard that decided she wasn't going to look at his paperwork that was valid and just told him to go straight to the hotel.
This is shocking. And your husband, my husband works in the oil patch too, so I can relate to, 2 weeks on. And does he have 1 week home? Is that how the hitches are working?
It used to be 2-on-1s. Obviously, when the price of oil went down, the companies had to do some reshuffling, and to make sure the guys got an equal share of work, they went to 2 and 2, which kind of worked out okay, because when they came back, that you're supposed to do your mandatory quarantine and stay at home. So great, he works 2 weeks in the middle of the desert, and then he has to sit at home for 2 weeks. But if that's what you do, that's what you do, right?
I guess, yeah. I mean, that's what you have to do to have a job. Then that's what you're going to do to have a job. Now, so he's going to spend at least 3 days of his 2 weeks home sitting in a COVID hotel that I guess, based on recent news, we know are not exactly the safest place to be these days.
I don't doubt that for him as a guy, he should be okay. Just sort of stay in your room, keep your head down, and all's good. Um, but there's wider reaching implications of this, because obviously his name is now down on the list of being detained kind of deal. He is supposed to fly back down to the States for his next hitch in 10 days. Well, when he comes out after 3, they've told him he has to quarantine for another 14 days. So does this now mean that he can't go back? Everything has this knock-on effect. And if nobody knows what the rules are, how are you meant to follow them? Do you know what I mean?
Sure, I do. And it appears as though your husband and his company, the guys on his rig, you did your best to follow these rules when nobody really seems to know what the rules are, including making sure that they were exempt from these quarantine measures because they are essential workers as oil and gas and energy workers, but also the fact that they travel back and forth across the border all the time. For example, if you're a CBC journalist and you travel back and forth all the time across the border, you don't have to quarantine. And your husband does the same traveling back and forth, but he now is taken to a COVID hotel.
Yeah, and they were saying, and it's not so much the fact that, oh, he doesn't have to quarantine when he gets back just because he's an essential worker. It's because if he gets a call in 2 days' time to go and sort something out on a rig in Canada, then he has to go. You know yourself, being in the oil patch. Once the guys have been in there for a while, this is their life.
Yeah.
They love the rigs and they do what they do, and they will go at the drop of a hat wherever they're needed. And this is why, and this was in the letter that was outlined when the company had actually asked the Alberta government for the letter of exemption. They state this, and one of the funny things was I said to my husband Darcy, so what did your border guard, the security lady, say when you showed her the letter? So she wasn't even interested in reading it. So I'm like, so what on earth is the point in us following the rules and regulations that they set out if somebody is just going to decide to wake up one morning and not do their job? Do you know what I mean? That's what angers me. How are we supposed to follow rules when those that are making the rules aren't following them themselves?
Sure. And if the rules are all about safety and health, then why are they open to the interpretation and discretion of the people at the border?
Exactly. And it's not as though there's a list of 400 occupations with XYZ amount of subsets that they've got to memorize in the space of 2 weeks. There's very few. You've probably looked over the exempt occupations yourself. There are actually very few. So it isn't something that, there's a huge gray area about. And they are trying to stop people, vacation traveling. We're just trying to make a living. It makes zero sense.
So, Manda, have you had any contact with your husband inside of the COVID hotel? Do you know where he is? Because we've heard from people who say that they take us to these things. They tell us we can't post to social media or text message our friends, and they don't even really tell us where we're going. Do you know where he is, or have you had any contact with him?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good.
He was texting me all the time. That
Great.
that's not been an issue, and he said that he's at the Best Western, which apparently isn't one of the ones that is listed down as a COVID hotel. So I don't know whether they have ones that are especially for the detainees at the airport as opposed to the people that have to book them. So he's just sitting in his room. He got bought breakfast this morning, which it wasn't the greatest thing in the world, but here's something else which is interesting as well. When they were saying this whole thing about, it's going to cost you $2,000. I think I know for a fact that this is probably to scare people into not traveling. because it didn't cost my husband that. It's cost him a quarter of that. And it's not about the money, but we're hearing from people sort of out at Pearson in Toronto that their hotels are costing sort of between 300 and 400. So if all these costs are now way below what was being stated, are the government throwing out this $2,000 just as a, oh, let's scare people into not doing it? Tell people the truth. I'm so angry about the whole smokescreen behind this thing. You can't have rules and then somebody interpret them in a way that is going to stop people earning a living. You just can't do that. And this is why people are getting annoyed. As soon as it starts to hit a person personally, you'll see that that's when the backlash is going to start coming. And the more wide-ranging that these rules are, and the more that they affect, the ordinary man on the street, that's when you're going to see people start to turn.
Amanda's husband did everything right, and yet his fate fell to the discretion of a government worker who isn't entirely clear about what exactly their job is these days, or how that job needs to be done, or what any of the new COVID rules are. One guy from her husband's rig just breezed right through and went home, and Amanda's husband is in a COVID camp for part of his time off. None of it makes any sense, but this whole thing has been poorly thought out. From the very beginning, you see, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau didn't close the border early to foreign nationals at the beginning of the pandemic, and so now his COVID cops are just snatching Canadians from the airport when they do everything right and follow the rules that nobody seems to know what the rules even are anymore. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. Hey, have you signed my friend Cian Bexte's new petition? You see, at Rebel News, we don't believe there should be COVID jails for Canadian citizens. Canadians should be able to come home to their own country without the threat of incarceration or a pseudo head tax of $2,000 to stay in some COVID quarantine hotel. Now, if you agree with us, please go to nocovidjails.com and sign our petition today.